Okay, I keep putting this off, so I'm going to read chapter 18 on page 381. Yes. Wait, I'm gonna move my microphone. Okay. Chapter 18. 381. I'm gonna go to 388. I think 388. That's about half. It's half-ish. Okay. Renewing the sectional struggle. The year 1848, highlighted by a rash of revolutions in Europe, was filled with unrest in America. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had officially ended with the war with Mexico, but had initiated a new and perilous round of political warfare in the United States. The vanquished Mexicans had been forced to relinquish an enormous tract of real estate, including Texas, California, and all the area in between. The acquisition of this huge domain raised anew the burning issue of extending slavery into the territories. Northern anti-slaverites had rallied behind the Wilmot Proviso, which flatly prohibited slavery in any territory acquired in the Mexican War. Southern senators had blocked the passage of the Proviso, but the issue would not die. Ominously, debate over slavery in the area of the Mexican Cession threatened to disrupt the ranks of both Whigs and Democrats and split national politics along north-south sectional lines. The popular sovereignty Pangea. Each of the two great political parties was a vital bond of national unity, for each enjoyed powerful support in both North and South. If they should be replaced by two purely sectional groupings, the Union would be in peril. To politicians, the wisest strategy seemed to be to sit on the lid of the slavery issue and ignore the boiling beneath. Even so, the cover bobbed up and down ominously in response to the agitation of zealous Northern abolitionists and impassioned Southern fire-eaters. Anxious Democrats were forced to seek a new standard-bearer in 1848. President Polk, broken in health by overworking chronic diarrhea, had pledged himself to a single term. The Democratic National Convention at Baltimore turned to an aging leader, General Lewis Cass, a veteran of the War of 1812. Although a senator and diplomat of wide experience and considerable ability, he was sour-visaged and somewhat pompous. His enemies dubbed him General Gas, and quickly noted that Cass rhymed with jackass. The Democratic platform, in line with the lid-sitting strategy, was silent on the burning issue of slavery in the territories. But Cass himself had not been silent. His views on the extension of slavery were well known because he was the reputed father of popular sovereignty. This was the doctrine that stated that the sovereign people of the territory, under the general principles of the Constitution, should themselves determine the status of slavery. Popular sovereignty had a persuasive appeal. The public liked it because it accorded with the democratic tradition of self-determination. Politicians liked it because it seemed a comfortable compromise between the Free Soilers' bid for a ban on slavery in the territories and Southern demands that Congress protect slavery in the territories. Popular sovereignty tossed the slavery problem into the laps of the people in the various territories. Advocates of the principle thus hoped to dissolve the most stubborn national issue of the day into a series of local issues. Yet popular sovereignty had one fatal defect. It might serve to spread the blight of slavery. Excuse me, hold on. My throat is not clear. Political triumphs for General Taylor. Okay, I'm good now. The Whigs, meeting in Philadelphia, cashed in on the Taylor fever. They nominated frank and honest Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, who had never held civil office or even voted for president. Henry Clay, the living embodiment of Whiggism, should logically have been nominated, but Clay had made too many speeches and too many enemies. As usual, the Whigs pussyfooted their platform. Eager to win at any cost, they dodged all troublesome issues and merely extolled the homespun virtues of their candidate. The self-reliant old frontier fighter had not committed himself on the issue of slavery extension, but as a wealthy resident of Louisiana living on a sugar plantation, he owned scores of slaves. Ardent anti-slavery men in the North, distrusting both Cass and Taylor, organized the Free Soil Party. Aroused by the conspiracy of silence in the Democratic and Whig platforms, the Free Soilers made no bones about their own stand. They came out foursquare for the Wilmot Proviso and against slavery in the territories. Going beyond the other anti-slavery groups, they broadened their appeal by advocating federal aid for internal improvements and by urging free government homesteads for settlers. The new party assembled a strange assortment of new fellows in the same political bed. It attracted industrialists miffed at Polk's reduction of protective tariffs. It appealed to Democrats resentful of Polk settling for part of Oregon while insisting on all of Texas, a disparity that suggested a menacing Southern dominance in the Democratic Party. It harbored many Northerners whose hatred was directed not so much at slavery as at blacks and who gagged at the prospect of sharing the newly acquired Western territories with African Americans. It also contained a large element of conscious Whigs heavily influenced by the abolitionist crusade, who condemned slavery on moral grounds. The Free Soilers trotted out wizened former President Van Buren and marched on into the fray, shouting, "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." These freedoms provided the bedrock on which the Free Soilers built their party. They condemned slavery not so much for enslaving blacks, but for destroying the chances of free white workers to rise up from wage-earning dependence to the esteemed status of self-employment. They argued that only the free soil in the West could a traditional American commitment to upward mobility continue to flourish. If forced to compete with slave labor, more costly wage labor would inevitably wither away, and with it the chance for the American worker to own property. As the first widely inclusive party organized around the issue of slavery and confined to a single section, the Free Soil Party foreshadowed the emergence of the Republican Party 6 years later. With the slavery issue officially shoved under the rug by the two major parties, the politicians on both sides opened fire on personalities. The amateurish Taylor had to be carefully watched, lest his indiscreet pen puncture the reputation won by his sword. His admirers puffed him up as a gallant knight and a Napoleon, and sloganized his remark, allegedly uttered during the Battle of Buena Vista: "General Taylor never surrenders." Taylor's wartime popularity pulled him through. He harvested 1,369,967 popular and 163 electoral votes, as compared to Cass's 1,222,342 popular and 127 electoral votes. Free Soiler Van Buren, although winning no state, polled 291,263 ballots, and apparently diverted enough Democratic strength from Cass in the crucial state of New York to throw the election to Taylor. Couldn't read. Okay, California Gold. Tobacco-chewing President Taylor, with his stumpy legs, rough features, heavy jaw, black hair, ruddy complexion, and squinty gray eyes, was a military square peg in the political round hole. He would have been spared much turmoil if he could have continued to sit on the slavery lid, but the discovery of gold on the American River near Sutter's Mill, California, early in 1848, blew the cover off. A horde of adventurers poured into the valleys of California, singing "Oh, Susanna," and shouting "Gold, gold, gold." They began tearing frantically at the yellow-graveled streams and hills. A fortunate few of the bearded miners struck it rich at the diggings, but the luckless many, who nettled blisters instead of nuggets, probably would have been money well ahead if they had stayed at home unaffected by gold fever, which was often followed by more deadly fevers. The most reliable profits were made by those who mined the miners, notably by charging outrageous rates for laundry and other personal services. Some soiled clothing was even sent as far away as the Hawaiian Islands for washing. Many of the 49ers who flocked into California kept chasing their dream of gold in even more distant places, notably Australia in 1851. The California gold rush attracted tens of thousands of people to the future golden state almost overnight, completely overwhelming the one-horse territorial government. A distressingly high proportion of the newcomers were lawless men, accompanied or followed by virtueless women. A contemporary song ran, "Oh, what was your name in the States? Was it Thompson or Johnson or Bates? Did you murder your wife and fly for your life? Say, what was your name in the States?" An outburst of crime inevitably resulted from the presence of so many miscreants and outcasts. Robbery, claim jumping, and murder were commonplace, and such violence was only partly discouraged by rough vigilante justice. In San Francisco in 1848 to 1856, there were scores of lawless killings, but only 3 semi-legal hangings. A majority of Californians, as decent and law-abiding citizens needed protection, grappled earnestly with the problem of erecting an adequate state government. Privately encouraged by President Taylor, they drafted a constitution in 1849 that excluded slavery, and then boldly applied to Congress for admission. California would thus bypass the usual territorial states, thwarting Southern congressmen seeking to block free soil. Southern politicians, alarmed by Californians' impertinent strokes for freedom, arose in violent opposition. Would California prove to be the golden straw that broke the back of the Union? Sectional balance and the Underground Railroad. Okay. The South of the 1850s was relatively well off. It then enjoyed, as it had from the beginning, more than its share of the nation's leadership. It had seated in the White House the war hero Zachary Taylor, a Virginia-born slave-owning planter from Louisiana. It boasted a majority in the cabinet and on the Supreme Court. If outnumbered in the House, the South had equality in the Senate, where it could at least neutralize northern maneuvers. Its cotton fields were expanding, and cotton prices were profitably high. Few sane people, North or South, believed that slavery was seriously threatened where it had already existed below the Mason-Dixon line. The 15 slave states could easily veto any proposed constitutional amendment. Yet the South was deeply worried, as it had been for several decades, by the ever-tipping political balance. There were then 15 slave states and 15 free states. The admission of California would destroy the delicate equilibrium in the Senate, perhaps forever. Potential slave territory under the American flag was running short, if it had not in fact disappeared. Agitation had already developed in the territories of New Mexico and Utah for admission as non-slave states. The fate of California might well establish a precedent for the rest of the Mexican Cession territory, an area purchased largely with Southern blood. Texas nursed an additional grievance of its own. It claimed a huge area east of the Rio Grande and north to the 42nd parallel, embracing in part about half of the territory of present-day New Mexico. The federal government was proposing to detach this prize, while hot-blooded Texans were threatening to descend upon Santa Fe and seize what they regarded as rightfully theirs. The explosive quarrel foreshadowed shooting. Many Southerners were also angered by the nagging agitation in the North for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. They looked with alarm on the prospect of a 10-mile square oasis of free soil thrust between slaveholding Maryland and slaveholding Virginia. Even more disagreeable to the South was the loss of runaway slaves, many of whom were assisted north by the Underground Railroad. This virtual freedom train consisted of an informal chain of stations through which scores of passengers were spirited by conductors from the slave states to the free soil sanctuary of Canada. The most amazing of these conductors was an illiterate runaway slave from Maryland, fearless Harriet Tubman. During 19 forays into the South, she rescued more than 300 slaves, including her aged parents, and deservedly earned the title of Moses. Lively imaginations later exaggerated the reach of the Underground Railroad and its station masters, but its importance was undisputed. By 1850, Southerners were demanding a new and more stringent fugitive slave law. The old one, passed by Congress in 1793, had proved inadequate to cope with the runaways, especially since unfriendly state authorities failed to provide needed cooperation. Unlike cattle thieves, the abolitionists who ran the Underground Railroad did not gain personally from their lawlessness. But to the slave owners, the loss was infuriating, whatever the motives. The moral judgments of the abolitionists seemed, in some ways, more galling than outright theft. They reflected not only a holier-than-thou attitude, but a refusal to obey the laws solemnly passed by Congress. Estimates indicate that the South in 1850 was losing perhaps 1,000 runaways a year out of its total of some 4 million slaves. In fact, more blacks probably gained their freedom by self-purchase or voluntary emancipation than ever escaped. But the principle weighed heavily with the slave masters. They rested their argument on the Constitution, which they claimed, not entirely implausibly, protected slavery, and on the laws of Congress, which explicitly provided for slave catching. Although the loss of property is felt, said the Southern senator, the loss of honor is felt still more. Got a little crunch with my ice, okay. Twilight of the senatorial giants. Southern fears were such that Congress was confronted with catastrophe in 1850. Free soil California was banging on the door for admission. Fire-eaters in the South were voicing ominous threats of secession. In October 1849, Southerners had announced their intention to convene the following year in Nashville, Tennessee, to consider withdrawing from the Union. The failure of Congress to act would easily mean the failure of the United States as a country. The crisis brought into the Congressional Forum the most distinguished assemblage of statesmen since the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The old guard of the dying generation and the young gladiators of the new. That immortal trio, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, appeared together for the very last time on the public stage. Henry Clay, now 73 years of age, played a crucial role. The great compromiser had come to the Senate from Kentucky to reprise the role he had played twice before in the Missouri and the nullification crises. The once glamorous statesman, though disillusioned, enfeebled, and racked by cruel cough, was still eloquent, conciliatory, and captivating. He proposed and skillfully defended a series of compromises. He was ably seconded by 37-year-old Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the little giant, 5 feet 4 inches, whose role was less spectacular but even more important. Clay urged with all his persuasiveness that the North and the South both make concessions and that the North partially yield by enacting a more feasible fugitive slave law. Senator John C. Calhoun, the great nullifier, then 68 and dying of tuberculosis, championed the South in his last formal speech. Too weak to deliver it himself, he sat bundled up in the Senate chamber, his eyes glowing with a stern face, while a younger colleague read his fateful words. I have, Senators, believed from the first that the agitation on the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. Although approving the purpose of Clay's proposed concessions, Calhoun rejected them as not providing adequate safeguards for Southern rights. His impassioned plea was to leave slavery alone, return runaway slaves, give the South its rights as a minority, and restore the political balance. He had in view, as was later revealed, an utterly unworkable scheme of electing 2 presidents, one from the North and one from the South, each wielding a veto. Calhoun died in 1850 before the debate was over, murmuring the sad words, the South, God knows what will become of her." Appreciative fellow citizens in Charleston erected to his memory an imposing monument, which bore the inscription, "Truth, Justice, and the Constitution." Calhoun had labored to preserve the Union and had taken his stand on the Constitution, but his proposals on their behalf almost undid both. Daniel Webster next took the Senate spotlight to uphold Clay's compromise measures in his last great speech, a 3-hour effort. Now 68 years old and suffering from a liver complaint aggravated by high living, he had lost some of the fire in his magnificent voice. Speaking deliberately and before overflowing galleries, he urged all reasonable concessions to the South, including a new fugitive slave law with teeth. As for slavery in the territories, asked Webster, why legislate on the subject? To do so was an act of sacrilege, for Almighty God had already passed the Wilmot Proviso. The good Lord had decreed, through climate, topography, and geography, that a plantation economy, and hence a slave economy, could not profitably exist in the Mexican Cession territory. Webster sanely concluded that compromise, concession, and sweet reasonableness would provide the only solutions. Let us not be pygmies, he pleaded, in a case that calls for men. If measured by its immediate effects, Webster's famed 7th of March speech of 1850 was his finest. It helped turn the tide in the North toward compromise. The clamor for printed copies became so great that Webster mailed out more than 100,000, remarking that 200,000 would not satisfy the demand. His tremendous effort visibly strengthened the Union sentiment. It was especially pleasing to the banking and commercial centers of the North, which stood to lose millions of dollars by secession. One prominent Washington banker canceled 2 notes of Webster's totaling $5,000 and sent him a personal check for $1,000 and a message of congratulations. But the free soilers and abolitionists who had assumed Webster was one of them upbraided him as a traitor, worthy of bracketing with Benedict Arnold. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier lamented, "So fallen, so lost, the light withdrawn which once he wore, the glory from his gray hairs gone forevermore." These reproaches were most unfair. Webster had long regarded slavery as evil, but disunion as worse. Deadlock and danger on Capitol Hill. The stormy congressional debate of 1850 was not finished, for the young guard from the North were yet to have their say. This was the group of newer leaders who, unlike the aging old guard, had not grown up with the Union. They were more interested in purging and purifying it than in patching and preserving it. William H. Seward, the wiry and husky-throated freshman senator from New York, was the able spokesman for many of the younger Northern radicals. A strong anti-slavery right, he came out unequivocally against concession. He seemed not to realize that compromise had brought the Union together and that when the sections could no longer compromise, they would have to part company. Seward argued earnestly that Christian legislators must obey God's moral law as well as man's mundane law. He therefore appealed, with reference to excluding slavery in the territories, to an even higher law than the Constitution. This alarming phrase, wrenched from its context, may have cost him the presidential nomination and the presidency in 1860. As the great debate in Congress ran its heated course, deadlock seemed certain. Blunt old President Taylor, who had allegedly fallen under the influence of men like Higher Law Seward, seemed bent on vetoing any compromise passed by Congress. His military ire was aroused by the threats of Texas to seize Santa Fe. He appeared to be doggedly determined to Jacksonize the dissenters, if need be, by leading an army against the Texans in person and hanging all damned traitors. If troops had begun to march, the South probably would have rallied to the defense of Texas, and the Civil War might have erupted in 1850. Breaking the congressional logjam. At the height of the controversy in 1850, President Taylor unknowingly helped the cause of secession by dying suddenly, probably of an acute intestinal disorder. Portly, round-faced Vice President Millard Fillmore, a colorless and conciliatory New York lawyer-politician, took over the reins. As presiding officer of the Senate, he had been impressed with the arguments for conciliation, and he gladly signed the series of compromise measures that passed Congress after the 7 long months of stormy debate. The balancing of interests in the compromise of 1850 was delicate in the extreme. The struggle to get these measures accepted by the country was hardly less heated than in Congress. In the northern states, Union savers like Senators Clay, Webster, and Douglas were rated on behalf of the compromise. The yelling Clay himself delivered more than 70 speeches as a powerful sentiment for acceptance gradually crystallized in the North. It was strengthened by a growing spirit of goodwill, which sprang partly from a feeling of relief and partly from an upsurge of prosperity enriched by the California gold. But the fire eaters of the South were still violently opposed to concessions. One extreme South Carolina newspaper avowed that it loathed the Union and hated the North as much as it did hell itself. A movement in the South to boycott Northern goods gained some headway, but in the end, the Southern Unionists, assisted by the warm glow of prosperity, prevailed. In June 1850, the assemblage of Southern extremists met in Nashville, ironically near the burial place of Andrew Jackson. The delegates not only took a strong position in favor of slavery, but condemned the compromise measures then being hammered out in Congress. Meeting again in November after the bills had passed, the convention proved to be a dud. By that time, Southern opinion had reluctantly accepted the verdict of Congress. Like the calm after a storm, a second era of good feelings dawned. Disquieting talk of secession subsided. Peace-loving people, both North and South, were determined that the compromises should be a finality, and that the explosive issue of slavery should be buried. But this placid period proved all too brief. Okay, I think that's all I'm reading. Solid.